Not all property comes with the complete deed. The wind was blowing hard that September afternoon when Thomas Mitchell stepped out of the wagon in front of the cabin he had just bought. The broker had been clear about the low price, but vague about the reasons. Thomas didn't care about mysteries. After 20 years of working on other people's farms, he finally had his own land. The cabin looked solid, built of oak wood that had stood up well to the years. The windows were intact, the roof showed no signs of leaking, and the chimney stood firm against the orange sky of the late afternoon. Thomas walked around the property, noting the well, the small barn, and the corrals that would need some repairs. Everything seemed too perfect for the price he had paid. As the sun began to set, Thomas decided to spend the first night in his new home. He unloaded his few belongings from the wagon, a simple mattress, a few pots, basic tools, and the remaining savings stored in a coffee can. He lit a fire in the fireplace and prepared a simple dinner with beans and jerky. It was then that he heard the first footsteps on the roof. These were no ordinary steps. The timber creaked under considerable weight, as if someone very heavy were walking up there. Thomas looked up, following the sound that moved slowly from one side of the hut to the other. After a few minutes, the footsteps ceased. Thomas waited in silence, the spoon of beans standing in the air. The wind howled outside, making the wood of the cabin groan softly. Maybe it was just falling branches, he thought, or some large animal that had climbed on the roof. But deep down, Thomas knew that no animal made that kind of sound. The next morning, he decided to investigate. He climbed onto the roof using an old ladder he found leaning against the barn. There were no signs of damage to the tiles, no footprints in the accumulated dust, no fallen branches. The roof was clean and intact, as if nothing had happened. Thomas went downstairs confused, but decided not to make a big deal out of the incident. He had work to do. He spent the day repairing the fences, cleaning the barn, and organizing his tools. In the evening, he went to the nearest town to buy supplies. At the grocery store, the owner greeted him with a nervous smile. The man seemed to know Thomas as the new owner of the Henderson cabin. His eyes avoided direct contact, and there was an awkward tension in his voice when he mentioned that he hoped Thomas had had a quiet first night. Thomas noticed the strange tone, but just nodded and made his purchases. As he left the store, he heard whispers between two men talking on the porch. They talked about someone poor thing, about 3 people, about finding out on their own. Thomas paused for a moment, but the men quickly walked away when they saw him approaching. He loaded his groceries into the wagon and returned home with an uncomfortable feeling in his chest. That second night, the sounds returned. This time it wasn't just steps. Thomas heard muffled voices coming from the attic, low-pitched conversations he couldn't understand. He took his flashlight and climbed the internal stairs that led to the upper floor of the cabin. The attic was empty. There was no furniture, there were no people, there was nothing but dust and cobwebs. But Thomas could sense that something was wrong. The air felt heavier up there, charged with a presence he couldn't explain. The voices had stopped as soon as he went up, as if whoever was talking had noticed his approach. Thomas descended slowly, the flashlight fluttering in his hands. He spent the rest of the night sitting in the kitchen with his rifle by his side, waiting for the sounds to start again. But the hut remained silent until dawn. On the third day, Thomas decided to search the city for answers. He went straight to the notary office where he had bought the property. The clerk, a thin man with small glasses, greeted him with the same uncomfortable expression that Thomas was already beginning to recognize. The man flipped through some papers, hoping that Thomas was adjusting well to his new home. When Thomas asked about 3 women, the clerk stopped fiddling with the documents and looked over his glasses. He denied knowledge of the matter. Thomas insisted that everyone in town seemed to know something he didn't. The broker had not mentioned anything about other occupants. The clerk sighed and took off his glasses, wiping them nervously. He explained that the property was Thomas's by law, but that any question about other occupants would be something he would have to resolve on his own. Thomas left the registry office more confused than before. He spent the rest of the day at the local tavern, trying to get information from the villagers, but everyone avoided the subject, switching up the conversation whenever he mentioned the cabin. It was only as the sun began to set that an old farmer, already drunk with drink, approached his table. The man had red eyes and a hoarse voice. He wanted to know if Thomas really wanted to know the truth about the three. The old man looked around, making sure no one was listening. He began to tell of 3 Henderson sisters who had lived alone in the cabin for more than 20 years. They were big, very big women. They never married, never had children, never left. According to him, they were not normal. They had died last winter, all 3 at the same time, on a snowy night. When neighbors went to check in the spring, they found the bodies, but there was something disturbing about them. They were huge, bigger than anyone had ever seen, and heavy. It took 8 men to try to carry each of them. The old man staggered to his feet and before leaving revealed the most unsettling detail of all. No one had been able to remove the bodies from the hut. The 3 Henderson sisters were still there, where they had always been. Thomas felt a shiver run down his spine as he took in the information. Now he understood why the property had been sold for such a low price, and why everyone in the city looked at him with that expression of mixed pity with fear. He had bought more than a cabin. He had bought a house with 3 permanent tenants. Thomas returned home that night with the weight of truth on his shoulders. The full moon illuminated the dirt path, but it could not dispel the darkness that had settled in his mind. 3 gigantic bodies remained in his new estate, hidden somewhere he had not yet discovered. The cabin looked different when he arrived. Not physically, but there was something in the atmosphere that had changed. The shadows seemed denser, the silence deeper. Thomas unhitched the cart with mechanical movements, his thoughts fixed on the old farmer's revelation. 8 men to carry each body. This meant that the Henderson sisters were true giants, far beyond what any normal person could imagine. And if no one could remove them, where exactly were they? Thomas inspected the cabin with fresh eyes. There were only 2 rooms on the ground floor, the kitchen with a living room and a small bedroom in the back. The attic he had checked seemed too small to house 3 bodies of the size described. That left only one possibility: a basement. He began to look for signs of an underground entrance. He moved the heavy furniture, examined every floorboard, checked behind the fireplace. Nothing. There was no visible trapdoor, no signs that the floor had been altered recently. But the sounds continued. That 4th night, Thomas was awakened by a different noise. It wasn't footsteps on the roof or voices in the attic. It was a heavy, slow drag, as if something very large was being moved across the ground. The sound came from below, from somewhere under his feet. Thomas stood up slowly, barefoot on the cold wooden floor. The dragging continued, moving from one side of the hut to the other. He took his flashlight and began to follow the sound, walking silently through the house. The noise stopped whenever he approached a certain point, resuming when he moved away. It was as if they were playing with him. The next morning, Thomas decided to investigate the area around the cabin. If there was a basement, there should be an external entrance. He walked around the perimeter of the building, examining every stone of the foundation, every unevenness in the terrain. It was then that he found it. Behind the hut, partially hidden by wild bushes, was a stone structure that appeared to be the entrance to an underground shelter. The vegetation growing on it suggested that it had not been used for a long time, but the stones were arranged in a deliberate way, forming a passageway that descended into the darkness. Thomas brushed away the bushes and cleared the entrance. A coarse ladder, dug out of the earth itself, descended into a narrow tunnel. The air rising from below was heavy and humid, laden with an odor he preferred not to identify. He took his most powerful flashlight and a rope. If I was going to go down, I wanted to make sure I could get back up. The descent was steep and the tunnel longer than I expected. The walls were compacted earth, reinforced with wood in some places. Someone had dug it with great care and planning. The tunnel stretched for about 20 meters before opening into a larger chamber. Thomas emerged into a spacious basement that stretched across the entire cabin area. The ceiling was low, forcing him to walk slightly bent, but the space was considerable. His lantern revealed wooden pillars that supported the floor above and niches carved into the side walls. And it was in the niches that he found them. 3 huge shapes lay each in its own space, dug into the wall. Even in the dim light of the lantern, Thomas could see that the old farmer's descriptions had been insufficient. The Henderson sisters weren't just big, they were colossal. Each of them measured at least 2.5 meters in height and was proportional in width. Their bodies were preserved by the cold and dampness of the basement, but Thomas could make out their features. They were middle-aged women with long grey hair, wearing simple clothes that had been cut and sewn to accommodate their extraordinary sizes. But there was something more disturbing than their sizes: their positions. None of them were lying down as would be natural for a dead person. The first was sitting, with her back resting on the dirt wall. Her eyes closed, but her head held high as if she were still observing something. The second was on its side, as if it had fallen asleep naturally. The third was in a position that made Thomas instinctively retreat, face down, arms outstretched forward, as if trying to drag himself out of the niche. Thomas stood there for several minutes, trying to process what he was seeing. These women had died in the winter, but their bodies seemed to have been carefully arranged, not simply abandoned. Someone had come down there and positioned them in that specific way. But who? And why? That's when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. On the dirt floor of the basement, there were fresh footprints. Huge footprints, corresponding to the size of the Henderson sisters' feet. And the footprints led from the wall, where the niches were, to an area directly under the kitchen of the cabin. Thomas followed in his footsteps, his heart pounding in his chest. They ended under a specific section of the floorboard, exactly where he had heard the shuffling sounds the night before. He raised his flashlight toward the ceiling and saw something that made him question his own sanity. There were deep scratches on the wood of the floor, marks left by fingernails or huge fingers trying to make their way through the planks. The marks were recent. Thomas retreated slowly, keeping the lantern facing the 3 niches. The Henderson sisters looked exactly as he had seen them before, motionless in their strange positions. But now he was sure that there was something fundamentally wrong down there. He climbed the tunnel faster than he had descended, emerging into the daylight with panting. He covered the entrance again with the bushes, but he knew that would not change anything. Whatever was happening in the basement would keep happening, with or without its discovery. He spent the rest of the day trying to find a rational explanation. Perhaps the footprints were ancient, preserved by moisture. Perhaps the scratches on the wood were from rats or other animals. Perhaps his imagination was creating connections where none existed. But when night came, Thomas knew that his attempts at rationalization were futile. The sounds resumed just as the last ray of sunlight disappeared behind the mountains. This time, Thomas could identify each noise. Heavy footsteps moving through the basement. The sound of someone or something trying to make their way through the floorboard. And occasionally, a sound that made her stomach turn. What seemed to be deep, laborious breathing, as if something very large was making a considerable effort. Thomas barricaded himself in the back room, pushing the heavy dresser against the door. He sat on the bed with the shotgun in his arms, watching the floor beneath his feet. The wood groaned and creaked, but resisted the efforts of what tried to emerge from below, for the time being. When dawn finally came, the sounds abruptly ceased, as they always did. Thomas pushed the dresser back into place and left the room. The kitchen floor showed new scratch marks, deeper than the previous ones. It was then that Thomas understood the terrible truth of his situation. He hadn't just bought a house with 3 permanent tenants. He had bought a property where 3 dead giants were slowly finding a way to regain possession of their old home, and they were getting stronger every night. The 5th night changed everything. Thomas had spent the day reinforcing the kitchen floor with extra planks he found in the barn. He nailed each piece of wood with desperate force, as if he could hold on forever to what was struggling to emerge from the hold. But deep down, I knew I was just postponing the inevitable. When it got dark, he prepared for another night of sounds and scratches. He positioned himself in the living room with the loaded rifle, a flashlight next to him, and a chair leaning against the wall farthest from the kitchen. I expected to hear the same familiar noises: heavy footsteps, laborious breathing, attempts to break through the woodwork. Instead, he heard something he had never heard before: beats. 3 slow, deliberate thumps on the floor from below. Then a break. 3 strokes again. Another pause. The pattern repeated itself for several minutes, always at the same pace, always in the same sequence. Thomas realized that these were not random attempts to break the wood. It was communication. The Henderson sisters were trying to talk to him. The farmer felt a chill run down his spine. All these days, I had assumed that I was dealing with some kind of haunting, something without consciousness or purpose other than wandering aimlessly. But organized beats suggested intelligence, planning, intention. The beating abruptly ceased. Thomas waited in the darkness, all his muscles tense, his shotgun pointed at the kitchen floor. For a long moment, the hut was completely silent. Then the floor began to give way. It was not a sudden break, but a slow and inexorable process. Thomas heard the timber groan and crackle under increasing pressure. The tablets he had nailed during the day began to separate one by one. Ancient nails popped out of their positions with metallic cracks, and then, through the first slit that opened, Thomas saw a hand. It was a feminine hand, but of impossible proportions. Their fingers were thick as tree branches, with long, yellowish fingernails that scratched the wood as they tried to find support. The skin had a pale, dull color, like old wax, but the muscles beneath it moved with terrible force. The hand found one of the support beams and clung to it. Thomas heard the sound of wood being crushed as the gigantic fingers closed around the goalpost. Slowly, something began to rise from the basement. First appeared the arm, thick as the trunk of a young tree, then the shoulder, covered by simple fabric, but which could not hide the muscle mass underneath. The neck then emerged, and finally the head. Thomas met face to face with the first of the Henderson sisters. She was even more impressive from the front than she had been in the basement. Its head was proportional to the gigantic body, with feminine features but amplified in a disturbing way. The eyes, which Thomas had seen closed in the cellar, were now open and fixed on him. They were intelligent eyes, eyes that recognized and analyzed. The giant propelled itself upwards with a fluid motion that defied its apparent size. The rest of the kitchen floor collapsed as it fully emerged, kicking up a cloud of dust and debris. She stood in the rubble, her head almost touching the roof of the cabin. Thomas was unable to move. Terror had frozen him in place, the useless shotgun in his trembling hands. The creature watched him for a long moment, tilting its head as if curious about his presence. Then she turned and walked calmly towards the fireplace. His footsteps made the entire cabin tremble. Every move was deliberate and controlled, without haste or aggressiveness. She crouched down before the fireplace, a movement that required bending almost in half, and began to pile wood with meticulous care. Thomas watched, fascinated and horrified, as the giant lit a fire. His huge hands manipulated the sticks with surprising delicacy. Soon the flames were crackling happily, illuminating the room with an orange glow. It was then that the other two emerged. The hole in the kitchen floor widened as the second sister propelled herself upwards. This one was slightly smaller than the first, but still impressively large. Her grey hair was tied in a thick braid that hung down her back. She emerged with more laborious movements, as if the effort was greater for her. The third sister took longer. Thomas could hear his efforts in the basement, noises of struggle and heavy breathing echoing through the hole. When it finally appeared, he understood why. This was the largest of the three, with shoulders so broad that she struggled to get through the opening her sisters had created. The three giants gathered in the room, moving around Thomas as if he were part of the furniture. They showed no hostility, but neither did they seem particularly interested in his presence. It was as if he was a temporary intruder in her home, something she would deal with later. The first sister, who had lit the fireplace, walked to the destroyed kitchen and began to remove the rubble. The second headed to the back room, from where Thomas soon heard the sounds of furniture being rearranged. The third simply sat down in the sturdiest chair in the room, which groaned dangerously under her weight, and began to watch the flames. Thomas realized that he was watching a domestic routine. The Henderson sisters had returned to their home and were resuming their lives as if death had been only a temporary interruption. The first sister finished cleaning the kitchen and disappeared into the basement, returning moments later carrying a gigantic pot that Thomas had not seen during his exploration. The second sister brought ingredients from somewhere. He couldn't imagine where they'd been stored all those months. They started cooking. The aroma that spread through the cabin was surprisingly normal. Beef stew with vegetables. Thomas felt his stomach churn, not from disgust, but from an involuntary hunger. He had not eaten a proper meal for days, surviving only on beans and jerky. The third sister, still sitting and watching the fire, turned her head slowly toward Thomas. Their eyes met, and for the first time since he had emerged from the basement, one of the giants actually recognized him. She didn't speak. Thomas wondered if they were still able to speak. But she made a slow, deliberate gesture with her hand, pointing first at him, then at an empty chair near the kitchen table. The invitation was clear. Thomas looked at the shotgun in his hands, then at the exit of the cabin, then again at the three impossible beings who had turned his new home into something out of a nightmare. He could try to run away. I could try to fight. He could try to scream for help, even though he knew no one would come. Or he could accept that his situation had changed irreversibly and try to understand what these creatures really wanted. Slowly, Thomas deposited the shotgun on the floor and walked towards the indicated chair. The first sister served a portion of the stew in a regular bowl. Apparently they still had human-sized crockery, and placed it before him. Steam rose from the food, carrying an aroma that made his mouth salivate involuntarily. Thomas looked at the bowl, then at the three sisters who were now watching him with what could be curiosity or expectation. I was about to have dinner with three dead giants in a cabin in the middle of nowhere, and the most disturbing part of the whole situation was that the food smelled delicious. He picked up the spoon with trembling hands and tasted the stew. It was perfect. 3 months have passed since that first supper. Thomas woke up every morning to the aroma of fresh coffee coming from the reconstructed kitchen. The first sister, whom he had learned to mentally call Martha by the embroidery on her clothes, always made coffee before dawn. The second, Prudence, tended the garden that had miraculously sprouted behind the hut. The third, Charity, spent her days repairing and improving the property with a skill that defied explanation. The routine had established itself naturally. The giants slept in the basement during the hottest hours of the day, emerging at dusk to resume their domestic activities. Thomas tended the cattle he had purchased, maintained the fences, and did the shopping in town. In the evening, everyone dined together in comfortable silence. Residents of the city stopped asking about his situation. Some had seen the sisters from a distance and simply accepted that certain things in the West were better left alone. The broker never showed up again to check on the property. Thomas discovered that the three women had died not of illness or age, but simply of exhaustion. Decades of living in isolation, being feared and avoided by neighbors, had taken their toll. They had given up on living, allowing the harsh winter to take them. But Thomas's arrival had brought something they hadn't experienced in a long time: purpose, someone to take care of, a home to maintain, a reason to continue existing. The farm prospered in an inexplicable way. Cattle put on weight quickly, crops grew plentiful, and Thomas had never felt healthier or stronger. There was a subtle magic at work there, fueled by the three sisters' dedication to keeping their home running smoothly. One night in October, while Thomas was mending a broken fence, Charity approached carrying the right tools before he even knew which ones he would need. They worked side by side until the fence was more solid than it had ever been. When they were done, she did something she had never done before. He placed his gigantic hand on Thomas's shoulder softly as a silent blessing. Thomas got the message. He was no longer an intruder in his home. It was family. The following spring, when the official papers arrived permanently transferring the property to his name, Thomas kept them without reading them. Human bureaucracy had become irrelevant. The true ownership of the farm had never been in question. The Henderson sisters had found someone willing to share their home, and Thomas had found something he had never known he was looking for, a place where he could fully belong, where his presence was not only tolerated, but needed. In the evenings, sitting at the dinner table with his three gigantic companions, Thomas sometimes wondered what he would say if someone asked about his life. But then I'd look around, at Martha serving a perfect pie, at Prudence mending her clothes with tiny stitches, at Charity feeding the fireplace with careful precision, and realize that some stories didn't need to be told. Some stories just needed to be lived. The West had always been a place where different people found ways to coexist. Thomas had discovered that this included the living and those who had chosen not to leave completely. On the Henderson sisters' farm, death and life coexisted in silent harmony, proving that not all haunting was a curse. Some were just homesickness. Did you like this story of the Wild West? Leave your like if you want more narratives like this. Comment on which Western story you'd like to see in the next video. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any Wild West adventures.